Welcome to Storymakers, the Storymakers podcast, a place where curiosity and play meet to spark faith through the imagination. I'm your host, Mel, and I will introduce you to new friends who will share hope for the kids and teens in your life, with a dose of encouragement for us grown-ups too. Let's get the party started. Hey, Storymakers, Mel here, and I'm here with my great friend, Esau McCaulley, and I'm so excited to have you back on the pod. Thank you, Esau, for joining us here in Storymaker Land.
You know, anytime you want me on the podcast, you just have to send the invite, and I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me again.
I love it so much. Well, last year when we were on the pod, you had just released a book, How Far to the Promised Land, which I love. Yeah, it's such a great book. If listeners out there, if you haven't picked up that book, that is a fantastic book. Great for all year round. Especially, I love it here in Storymaker World because we always are talking about how God's story is a long story. Yeah. And there is a plot twist, many plot twists throughout the whole thing. I love it so much. But today, Esau's with us, and he has some. I mean, I want to say you're pretty active as a writer. Just in the last 12 months, I can't even imagine how many words you have written down, but we do know that you have some books that were released in this last year. So what do you have out in the world, Esau?
Well, there's one book that is actually out that they can physically get a hold to. That's New Testament in color. And to be honest, I only wrote a small portion of this because it's a single volume commentary that brings together Black, White, Asian, Latino, and First Nations peoples to write a commentary on the New Testament. So I only wrote the introduction and then an article, and then I wrote on Ephesians in here. Yeah. But the book that is available for pre-order is that this is called Josie. I said Josie. See, you had me thinking about the other one. It is Andy Johnson.
I tripped you up.
Yeah, I already tripped me up. Andy Johnson and the March for Justice. And that one comes out December 17th.
That's fantastic. Well, I just want to know on the I like how you're very low key about the New Testament book. It's fantastic. The intro got me hooked right away. Ephesians is a very important book in the Bible. And I will mention that Christianity Today did give you guys an award for your commentary.
Yes, we were chosen as the best book, the book of the year in biblical studies. So according to Christianity Today, it is pretty good book for you to buy. And I think Christianity Today is correct. So I think that you should get it too. And it really was, it's interesting the things that people latch on to and identify with, because I've been surprised by the popularity of this book. I just thought, sometimes you have to write stuff because you want to see it in the world. Mm-hmm. And I started on that book when I was working on Reading While Black. So this book has actually been in process for like 4 years. And when I was working on my first kind of non-academic, non-dissertation book, Reading While Black, it focused a lot on the African American church. But I had this really strong sense that the church included everybody. And so although it was important to talk about the witness of the Black church in America, I thought it was also important to talk about the witness of other Christian communities and how we can learn from each other. And so I just wanted that book to exist. And I've been pleasantly surprised that a lot of other people wanted the book to exist too. So that's been a real encouragement.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, I read your bits.
Yeah.
I'm sure the other parts are very good, but Ephesians was very fruitful and helpful for, story makers. We do our research too. So
there we go.
Commentaries. We can't just be writing for kids without any context. So having that's dangerous. The fun thing that Esau has out is the Andy Johnson book. And before we rolled on the podcast, I was asking Esau, because he has another book that came out. Yeah. Was that 2 years ago? Or
2 or 3 years ago, called Josie Johnson's Hair and the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, so I was like, are these people related? What's going on? Is there a theme?
Yes, there's a theme. Let me first of all, it's a part of a series called the Johnson Family. It's the Johnson Family series. The first book was Josie Johnson's Hair and the Holy Spirit. The second one is Andy Johnson and the March for Justice. And if you actually paid attention, my first kid's book was Josie Johnson's Hair. So it's like the Johnson and so that's kind of how the series works together. But what happened was someone reached out to me during the pandemic and said, would you be interested? This is how I got into children's literature. Would you be interested in writing a children's book? And if you might remember the pandemic, it was kind of a depressing time. We were all locked into our homes. Yeah. And I didn't want to write any kind of really technical stuff. Mm-hmm. And there's something about getting your mind around what it might mean to communicate to a child that is very hopeful and very life-giving. And I thought about, once someone asked me to do it, I was like, yeah, like sometimes academics are saying we can portray ourselves as being too good for children's literature. That was for someone else. And I was like, who's more worthy of our best efforts and time than our children? And I thought about how often I didn't have resources for my kids that either there are some that were really good on the spiritual part. Mm-hmm. There were some that were really good on the cultural identification part. And I wanted something that was like deeply Christian, but also that recognized who my children were. And so the first book was about a dad who takes his daughter to get her hair done. And that's because I used to take my daughter, my second oldest daughter, to get her hair done. Her middle name is Josephine. And so she sometimes goes by Josie at camp. So Josie, and then Johnson was my high school, J.L. Johnson High School. So Josie Johnson was the name that we created. It was patterned after me and my daughter. But I don't know if anybody who listens to the podcast has children.
I hope so.
If you put out a book that features one of your kids and not the other three kids, there is drama.
There better be a Peter coming.
Yes, and so hold on, we're about to get there. That's what I'm trying to explain to you. So it was my second oldest daughter, and so she was very like, I got a book and y'all don't got a book, and the kids said like, why don't we have a book? And so it is true that I called my publisher, and I said, listen, I got an idea for 3 other books because I got 3 other kids. I didn't say this to them, but I said I got 3 other books. Yeah, I wanted peace in my house. And so the second book, Andy Johnson, it's because my son's middle name is Andrew. So that's where the Andy comes from. And it is about a march that a family takes their kid to. So I didn't take, and this actually during 2020, there were some marches that were going on around in our community in the Chicago area. And so our family doesn't actually go to a march, but me and my wife went to different kinds of events. And we had to do a lot of talking to our kids about what it meant to be a Christian who engaged in protest. And so Andy, there is the second of the Johnson kids who then has their own story. There's another one about Andy Johnson, who is the third kid. And then the fourth one is Isaiah Johnson. And I can't give you all the titles yet because I'm not sure that I'm allowed to. But this one comes out in December and the other ones will come out. So eventually there'll be at least 4 Johnson family books. And maybe I'll return back to Josie and just do it all again after that.
I love it. Well, you know what's so cool? I think people often are worried about like Gen Z and Alpha and the next generation. And, and I think worried about anxiety and depression. But one of the superpowers I think of Gen Z and Alpha is that they're hyper aware of what's happening in the world. Yeah. And so I think that this book, Andy Johnson and the March for Justice, is important because we can't pretend or avoid that they know stuff. Yeah. And then we need to be able to like equip and talk to them about like within a faith context of like, well, how do we move forward in life with hope and trust? Yes. That there's a resurrection and that means something. And so, this book, Esau, does that kind of tackle that?
Yeah. This is one of the hard things because I think that anytime something happens in society, the question that a parent has to ask is, what is the line between protecting my kids from, having to deal with adult things versus wanting them to be aware of what's going on in the world? And how do we explain it? because normally when things happen, you don't, you kind of edit the story to make it kind of kid palatable. And so for example, this book here is an example of a family that tries to do that. And even the language of marching for justice may not be a normal march. You don't just march for justice. Normally there's something that happens in society, but we thought about explaining too much of those scenarios might be complicated for kids. And so we made it a little bit, they're marching for justice, which is underlining most protests. And so we explained to, in the story, you talk about, historically in the past when people were denied rights, people of faith, especially the Black church in the South, like march for justice to get the laws changed. And then it talks about like how the family does this. And so it does help. The whole point of it is for you to be able to use this as a conversation piece. Like, what does it mean to be a kid who may be concerned about fair treatment? And what can you do? And like, what does marching mean for the Christian? And how might it be a way of speaking about what it means to follow Jesus? Because a march is a kind of a decision, right? To protest something by using nonviolence is an alternative to violence. And so it is a way of talking to children about what does it mean to engage in, this sounds way more complicated, but nonviolent protest. One of my favorite scenes, I'm allowed to like show you some of the things, the children sit down at one point in the book, and they actually create signs for the march. And they sit and they talked about, well, what kind of sign should I make? And so it took me a while to find it, but here's a picture of the family sitting in the living room thinking about the kinds of signs that they're going to make. And so those kinds of things, like if you were going to write something as a kid, this was a good conversation piece for the kid. If you're going to write something about fair treatment as a believer and you had 5 words, what would you say? And so those are the kinds of things that are discussed in the book. And hopefully it's fun too. It's not just a long parable, but it depicts kind of a family that likes each other and that has fun together.
Yeah, I mean, it's, justice and being an image bearer are all Christian things. And so when you've got kids, it seems that those aspects of who we are as humans are really available to them. They're not sort of filtered. They haven't sort of built in like, I don't know, all the layers that grownups built in. And so being able to engage kids in all sorts of different topics is important. And then to be, within the context of their age and, what they're about and not oversharing and giving them.
And I guess I think part of what makes these books particularly important to me is because if you remember, and I know it feels like we've kind of memory hold the pandemic, except for to argue about it in politics.
Yeah.
But I want to remind us of what it was like to be a kid or a parent of a child who was kind of experiencing like death publicly or seeing and hearing about death publicly for the first time. And so you have to sit down and kind of really explain to them, what it really like, what the brokenness of the world. And how do you have hard conversations with the kids that aren't frightening, overly terrifying to them?
Yeah.
And so that skill that I had, that muscle that I had to learn how to exercise became a key part of my writing process. So these books were like, I call them the last of the pandemic books because you all are seeing them now and they're not about the pandemic, but they were written like with the reality that like sometimes the world is complicated and sometimes the world is hard. And how do you introduce your kids to hard things without crushing their spirit?
Because
that's what I was trying to get
interface them. And, so oftentimes I think we think of childhood and we want to like protect it, like it's a terrarium or something like that. But part of our job is to engage stories so they can build resiliency and they can see that people come through stuff. And when they face stuff, then that God is with them and is going to see them on the other side.
We all watched My Girl and we survived as kids.
was so traumatic.
That might be dating us, putting us at a certain age. But I remember my girl, I was like, I can't handle this.
Like, oh my gosh.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, kids die. Yeah.
Exactly.
I ran into, I was speaking at this event, and I ran into oh my goodness, I'm gonna forget the book. She wrote the book, The Bridge to Terra Bithia. Is that the name of it?
Oh yes.
I forget her name.
Yeah.
But yeah, like these, they were writing some stories where kids were kind of going through it. And so
I mean, Roald Dahl just gets out the gate right away with like, your parents are dead, you're an orphan, you got to live with this terrible other grown-up, or you're in a boarding school or whatever, wherever they put you. I mean, Dickens is similar too in that way. And it's like we're really attracted to those stories because they're relatable, because of the pain point. And then we want to see the hope and resiliency. I mean, and that's what I love so much about How Far to the Promised Land, because there was so many moments like that.
Yeah, I think that sometimes when you are a writer and you do things like you write Bible commentaries and you write even something like Reading While Black, people could begin to think of you merely as a brain. It was Captain Patterson, that's who it was. The Bridge to Terabithia. People can begin to think of you as a brain who is a Christian because like God works for you and you have all of these intellectual defenses. And they can begin to think of the Christian faith as, here's a list of objections to Christianity. If these 10 are solved, then I become a Christian. But my Christian life isn't simply a matter of me thinking thoughts about God. It is actually a life with God across time. And so the reason I wanted to write, and people can also, they see you and, arrive at a certain place as an adult, and they may even think that you had an easy life, and that's why you're a Christian. And I want to say, no, like, just because the sweater covers up the scars, it doesn't mean there's not scars under the sweater. Yeah. And so what I was trying to do in How Far to the Promised Land is to say, yes, there's intellectual defenses of Christianity that are important, but there are also experiences of God in my actual life where God was there not as an argument, but as a person. And a person who sought me when I wasn't seeking him, that I also think it was important for people to know about. And so I've been glad that people have enjoyed it. As a matter of fact, How Far to the Promised Land, of all the books that I've written, it's the one that people get the least mad about me. I've got no How Far to the Promised Land. I've got no
your experience.
Yeah, but like even something like Andy Johnson, there are people who kind of go, what are you talking about race and justice with kids for? But like, people at least allow you to tell your own story, and that's at least been positive.
Well, kids are going to ask questions, and so we need resources and the ability to like engage those questions, because the hope and goal really is that your kids know that God is for them and with them. And I think people get tripped up when that intersection of like, oh, this Christian thing isn't working, or look at these Christian people doing that thing. And it's just like, well, is the story true? And does, my image bearing and my care for others, like, that's part of being, a child of God, that desire to care about other people or hurt for other people. Like that's a God thing, to think of your neighbor and people you don't even know. Like that's definitely a God thing.
I completely agree. So we're on the same side there.
Yeah. Well, Esau, so you've got the New York Times cooking up and all sorts of things, and the podcast. That's sort of a new thing. I mean, you're interviewed, you're all over the place with different podcasts, different spaces, but now you got your own. Like, how's that going?
So, I think that one of the things is I felt like there was a lot of podcasts that existed, and they're great. I learned from them, that are very politics heavy, and they were kind of in a politics season. And then there are other podcasts that are very, very theology heavy. And like, I have interest in theology and I'm interested in politics. But one of the things that my friends who might know me outside of my public life is that I have a lot of interests that aren't always directly religious, and that I care about movies and sports and television and all of those things. And I'm thinking about those things as a Christian. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to create a podcast that took culture seriously as a way of revealing something about God. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like our culture is always teaching us, like the movies that are popular reveal something about who we think we are.
Yeah.
And so I was just talking to my wife about this the other day, and maybe I am a hopeless romantic or whatever. But I think that there is something interesting about the fact that a lot of our kind of current romantic comedies are at the core of them, like maybe slightly nihilistic. Mm. Like there is no sense that like this relationship is going to last. You kind of see a season in this movie where things are good, but it always opens up with this could fall apart tomorrow. And I'm not saying that every single romantic comedy needs to end in a wedding, but I used to like the movies where like at the end there's a wedding and there's a wedding party, and there was a sense of hopefulness that relationships might actually be able to persist. And I think part of it is because we grew up, as the children of divorce. We've experienced divorce and brokenness in our own like friends and family. And so it feels for us possibly even inauthentic to show movies that are just kind of saccharine and hopeful when we have experienced so much disappointment. So I think that skepticism about the lasting nature of love is reflected in our films. And that then teaches us to say, well, what do we need to be to give people resources and hope that you might be able to have kind of something that is steady and healthy in your life. And so those kinds of things are just examples of things that we talked about. We talked about even like something like in sports. We talked about like the WNBA and like what the racial politics of the WNBA may have to talk about, show about what's going on in society. And so I always think that if you are paying attention, the wounds of the culture and even the beauty of the culture is always showing up in our art. And I just want to be able to talk about that and not have to do, and I got my day job is Bible, but to be able to have another outlet. It isn't Bible all the time. So we just had speaking of New York, I know you're in New York. We just had Alyssa Wilkinson, who's the movie reviewer for the New York Times. She was the one who just recorded an episode today. Who knows when people are going to hear it? But is it this? There's the audio. I mean, there's a video component to this podcast too, right?
Yeah. So
the people are deep enough in the dive. They would notice that whenever that podcast come out, I have the same sweater because I just got off the phone with her a little while ago. So if you want to do like a timestamp,
Esau some clothes.
But I would say people like sometimes I record multiple podcasts in one day. It's not that I only got one sweater. It's not my fault.
No, well, I mean, I love what Madeline L'Engle said was like the good art identifies the chaos, but points us towards the cosmos. Yeah. And as you're describing this podcast to me, it's like we need interpreters because we relate to like the broken pieces or the dark things, or it's like, right, I watched that show or I watched that movie, and there's something about that I relate to that in my humanity, but I wish there was like hope or something, there was, I need the loop to be closed, and the podcast sounds like that's what you guys are hoping to achieve. Yeah. But,
sometimes we achieve it. Sometimes like the silly part of me just comes out and it's all chaos. So like, and the other thing that one of the other good things about, I think I have undiagnosed ADHD. That's probably why I'm always doing 15 different things. And so sometimes if you listen to the podcast, my ADHD wins sometimes. So like right now, I'm super listening to everything the Mill has to say, but you know what I'm thinking? That's an amazing hat. I want one of those cool story makers hat. Because it's like it is just for those of you who are listening, who are watching it, it's just an amazing hat. And that's what I've been thinking about the entire time. Now that I said
well, I love the sweater. Is that for Scotty?
Oh, this is actually it's a bear. People always make fun of me because I have like this Paddington Bear looking character on my sweater. It's because like I'm not that tough of a guy, and so this is my way of embracing my inner softy. So yeah, it's just a teddy bear on a sweater.
Well, if you can write a commentary and a kid's book in the same year, I think that there's some flexibility in your creativity. I mean, Esau, you're one of the most creative people I know, and your mind is always at work. Were there other literary people in your world when you grew up? I mean, in your family?
No. I mean, one of the interesting things is I was always a reader as a kid.
Okay.
But I'm not actually a very fast reader. And so it's hard for me to read large amounts of material very quickly. And so that meant that whenever there was an assignment, and maybe this is why I'm a little bit creative, I couldn't just read all of the stuff and then just summarize it. I would just have to read enough to know what I thought, and then I would just write my papers. And so my papers were always a little bit light on research and heavy on creativity. So that might be bad for a scholar, but I'm just telling you, I'm not reading all y'all stuff. You keep all these books. I'm gonna read enough of them, then I'm gonna write what I want to think anyway. But I think that I've always been someone who expressed themselves through writing. And I listened to a lot of African American preaching, and the rhetoric of people like Martin Luther King and the Black, it's very ornate. And so I think that my sense of poetry was influenced by like the Black preaching tradition and hip hop, which is also very creative.
Yeah.
Now I can't sing, right? And I can't do real poetry, but the idea of attending to words and the beauty of words is just something that has always been a part of me. And even when I used to be a preacher, I guess I am a preacher now because I'm now planning a church.
Yeah.
I got to get used to saying now that I'm a preacher. But when I first started preaching, I had to learn how to tone down some of my flowery rhetoric, but I realized that's because the writer in me that was trying to get out. So I think I've always been a writer, and there's something about a beautiful sentence, and I think that anyone who's been a writer knows this. And there's what I call a double thrill when you write something. First is the idea itself. It gives you a sense of adrenaline. Like, this is great. I enjoy this act of creation. But really what the joy is like, I am excited because I'm anticipating the excitement of the reader. And so as a writer, it's like, oh, I just wrote a sentence here, and this sentence is going to be like beautiful. And so I can't wait until I hear, or I can't wait to have someone else experience that joy. And in some sense, I think that the idea that you create something and you give it away for the joy of other people, that is deeply Christian, right? That my writing is for the sake of the joy of others. As a matter of fact, I'm working on a piece right now about Christmas that I can't tell you about because it's not out yet. But between podcasts today, I've been working on this article, and there's a sentence or two in this article. There's some of the I'm more excited about this than anything I've written in a long time. And so I think there's something about, this is a way for me to give joy to other people. And that anticipation is something that is always in my mind. As a matter of fact, what I really want to do, if I ever have time, is to write a full-length fiction book. Because most of my reading outside of theology is actually fantasy fiction. And so I've started on a couple of times, like a fantasy fiction book, but I've just been busy doing other stuff. But yes, I've written across like a lot of different genres. I've written commentaries, I've written theology books, I've written kids books, I've written memoirs, I've written opinion pieces, I've done reported news stories. But what the last horizon of something I have not yet accomplished that I do want to do one day is to write a full-length work of fiction.
Well, we're young, Esau, so there's lots of time.
Yes, there's time. Pray for me that I have energy and creativity.
It's going to happen. Well, I mean, I think that...
but also I have to feel like I just sneak it to my agent. Because if I tell my agent I'm writing, she's like, why are you doing this, Esau? So I'm hoping I'm probably going to have to just write the whole thing and then just send it to her and say, I did it on the slide. Is it any good? Is it good? Take this and find somebody who wants to publish it.
Well, that's the thing about creativity too. When you've got it in motion and it's accessible to you, you just want to. I mean, I think it's also like an image bearing thing. It's a gift thing. It's like God has given you a gift, and it's meant to be in the world, and it's meant to be shared. It's like if you're an amazing chef and you only cook for yourself, that'd be so weird. But, it's like, oh, I'm going to share this with all my friends and people, and observing them enjoy the thing is like the greatest gift. So I find it to be, I think it's all very similar to akin.
But I'll also say the other thing that you learn that's deeply Christian about writing is how much failure you experience. I mean, people see the books that come out. They don't see the books that are like the ideas that are rejected. They see the opinion pieces that come out, but they don't see the amount of times that you pitch an idea and you're told no. And one of the things that writing actually allows you to do is to hopefully separate your self-worth from the thing that you produce. So that if you write something that no one wants to read, or if you put a book out that doesn't do as well as you would like, it doesn't mean that God loves you any less. And what I've had to learn as a writer is to say, I am not my work. That the pleasure that God, the joy that God has in his relationship with me does not increase by 20% if I win a book award. Like God did go, you know what, Esau, I wasn't sure about you until you got that CT Biblical Studies Book Award. Now, welcome to my kingdom. No, I think that he was satisfied with me, or his graciousness had changed my life before that. And he doesn't give me like an extra bump of grace because I produced something that people bought. And so I do want to say to people who are writers and creatives out there that it is not the outcome. And I'll even say that the things that mean the most to me are the people who write and tell me the impact that a book had on them. Not any kind of, award. Awards are nice, and I'm glad that, I've gotten them. But there are things that I put a lot of effort into that didn't get any recognition at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's
very little recognition. No recognition will be dishonored. Very little, not as much. I can't lie. I mean, like, people just go and Google and say, like, all of his books won awards. What he's talking about. So I don't want to lie, but not as all of the recognition. No one gets enough recognition that they think they deserve. It's such a good book. People should love it.
The word became flesh. There's something about words that really like come alive and are living organisms in so many ways. And I was just talking to one of our global partners this last week, and we did a translation for teen zines, and we just send stuff out, and you just never know. And you're like, oh, like we serve 5,000 kids. That's great. Or whatever. You're like, that's amazing. But when you get these impact, like connections with people, and they're like, no, this really, I didn't know that God was for me until I read this thing, or these kids didn't really understand that. And then you're like, oh, I can't even believe that I get to be a vehicle to, you just don't know where it's going to land, and you just keep writing and you keep creating, and God's going to do God's thing with it. So either way. Yeah. That's so great. Well, Esau, we love to ask everybody, what stories it sounds like you're reading fiction. So what stories captured your imagination as a kid or as a grown-up? The listeners love to know.
Right now, I can tell you the story that's occupying a lot of my time is The Christmas Story.
Ooh.
And I've been reflecting a lot on like baby Jesus. Because, and this is something I'm writing about it, so hopefully it'll come out in print later, is the most amazing thing about, one of the amazing things about The Christmas Story is that Jesus himself doesn't interpret it. He can't speak. He's literally a kid.
Yeah.
And so a lot of us are interpreting like what's happening at Christmas. But what God himself does is the mere thing itself. In other words, he doesn't love us in words on Christmas. It's actually a deed. It is the incarnation. And you just have to look at this act that he has done for us. And God literally says, I want you to think about what this means about me and the world. And we all get it, right? In other words, the act of the incarnation and Jesus being born in humble circumstance is itself the sermon. And humanity is called to look at this event and say, what does this mean for my understanding of the depth of God's love? And what does it mean for the way in which the world has changed? And if the world has changed through divine vulnerability, if that is how kind of the story turns in earnest, what does it mean for how we might change the world? Does it give us permission to be vulnerable? Does it give us permission to cry? Because Jesus's first words are the moans that are common to all of creation, the tears of children. And so I've been thinking a lot, because we're in Christmas season, about divine vulnerability. And I think that even kids, my kids get so mad at me because they don't think this is funny. I think I said, I loved you when you didn't have bladder control. Like, Dad, that's gross. That's gross. And I was like, no, when you were completely dependent upon someone else and you had nothing to offer in the relationship.
Nothing.
And I loved you. And I said, but the fact that God would have that amount of vulnerability, that if his mother Mary doesn't breastfeed him, he dies. If Joseph doesn't whisk them off, they die.
Egypt, yeah.
And so the world, and so it's not even in some sense, it's not a sermon, right? God doesn't. The act is the sermon. And so I just thought about, what does it mean to really have my life changed by an act that means so much to me? So that's where I am in the story that's capturing my imagination right now.
That's amazing. Well, I love it. We just launched a
yeah.
This is our baby Jesus.
Yeah, baby Jesus.
There is so much in that. It's hard for people to take a beat, for all of us, really, because the season is so crazy, but to realize like how vulnerable our Savior was coming into the world, so human. I'm excited. I can't wait to read whatever you might be cooking up for this season.
Well, pray that it makes its way through the various steps out into the world somewhere. It'll be out. I'm going to guarantee you this one I'm going to make sure it gets sent somewhere, because I'm passionate about it.
I love it. Well, we are too. Well, Esau, it's been so great to have you. So we will point our friends over to the Holy Post podcast.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Well, no, it's the Esau McCaulley podcast. Forget the Holy Post. I'm just kidding. I love them. The Holy Post is the flagship podcast. My podcast, I'm under the umbrella. Like, you guys are under Mockingbird.
Mockingbird, right? But we're Storymakers podcast.
We're Storymaker podcast. Not the Esau McCaulley podcast. Not that there's another Esau podcast.
There might be, and it might be strange.
Might be good. Yes, so it might be good. But if you want the Esau McCaulley podcast, you got to put Esau McCaulley into the subject bar, and you'll find us there wherever you listen to podcasts.
Well, and Cap, pick up Andy and Josie Johnson. I love it. Collect them all. And if you're into commentaries, the Ephesians take is great. Love it so much. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having us. And we can't wait to connect soon. Thanks for listening. Today's episode of the Storymakers podcast was made possible by donors and produced by Mockingbird Ministries. Listen to more episodes and join the adventure at StorymakersNYC.com or follow us along on Instagram. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget, share the show with a friend or maybe two, and use the code SMPodcast10 for 10% off your next order. Catch you next time.